Hello and welcome to our latest episode of Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center. Honored to be hosting us for today. And with us, we have three of the best experts we could possibly assemble on European politics, on British politics, on Brexit, and everything before and everything after. We have Dr. Amanda Sloat from the Brookings Institution, previously a senior official at the State Department, National Security Council staff, and Capitol Hill, among other interesting experiences, including, as we heard with our breakfast with our students this morning, some fascinating yoga sojourns in South Asia and South America. So not that we'll have time, but if we did, it might be interesting to explore that and what that means for Brexit too. So.
The world would be a better place if more people did lots of yoga.
Okay, amen. So, well, when I was first dating my wife, she dragged me to a few yoga classes there in DuPont Circle, and I'm probably a better man for it.
Have you returned since you got married?
I have not. Again, and maybe I'm a lesser man for that. So anyway, and then we've got Dr. Michael Mosser, professor here in the International Relations program at UT and an expert on European security. And then we have Dr. Lawrence Rede, Hungarian by birth, American by choice, and a former staff member in the European Parliament, as well as a scholarly expert on European politics. So, Amanda, let's turn to you first. And because we have an interest here at the Clements Center in the relationship between history and current policy challenges, how did we get to this moment? And I don't mean, well, there was a vote, the Brexit vote in 2016, but rather looking at the longer term trends of British politics. Can you look back over the last 10, 20, 30, 50 years? And do we now see what might have been a couple of hinge points that were maybe not so evident at the time? Was it the decision in 92 to stay out of the single currency? Is this a longer term phenomenon of British skepticism or ambivalence towards the continent? How did we get to this point?
I think we can go back a number of years. As you say, there has always been some British skepticism about the European project and some questions about whether or not they shared the ultimate vision of this. The UK was not one of the original founding members of the European Union. They had questions about the economic project. They wanted to maintain their ties to the Commonwealth and weren't sure that they wanted to join. But then as things developed, I think there was a fear of being left out. There was a desire to benefit from some of the economic gains of integration. And then, of course, the French blocked them from joining for a period, but they eventually did join. As you say, that skepticism continued, and they ended up not joining some of the flagship projects of the European Union, including opting out of the Schengen Common Travel Area and opting out of membership in the single currency, the euro. So in this long-running debate about how much you deepen integration, how much you instead focus on widening integration, whether or not the EU should ultimately be an economic club focused on intergovernmental decision-making, which was more of what the Brits preferred, as opposed to more of the continental model to include a lot broader political integration and deepen the union. There never was entirely a joined-up vision between the UK with some of their continental neighbors.
So, Lawrence, let's turn to you now, particularly putting on your hat as a former policymaker in the European Parliament, as well as a scholar. Tell us if you can, speak for the EU, right? Tell us the EU perspective on Brexit. I mean, just how much of a shock was this? Has this, what kind of, if any, introspection or reconsideration has this provoked inside Brussels? Realizing that obviously they need to get through this near-term crisis and change. But I mean, tell us what it looks like from Brussels.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the main thing to understand is that Brexit has been all-consuming in UK politics for the past 3 years, and it has essentially just been an irritation for the EU. I think the EU is not, for the EU, Brexit is not the biggest thing on the agenda. I think it's something that is holding them back from talking about the real things that they want to talk about, whether that's global climate change, whether that's figuring out how to deal with Hungary and Poland, who are undermining the rule of law, and democracy in their countries, dealing with the migration crisis, right? So to me, for the European Union, this has mostly been a distraction that they wanted to just get over with. I think it was a shock. Nobody expected the Brits to vote leave. But now that they've done so, I think the general perspective is let's just spend as little time on this as possible. And I think one good indication that this is the case is that the last time that the European Union member states needed to give the UK yet another extension of the deadline to leave, the heads of state didn't even meet. This was decided on a lower level. So I think that shows that this is just not an issue. The EU does not want to be left holding the hot potato of being blamed that they kicked the Brits out. They need the Brits to make that decision on their own, because I think for political reasons, they don't want to be held responsible for it. But besides that, I don't think they care that much. And I think the reason for that is simply a size question, right? So if you look at the United Kingdom, about half of their trade and investment has to do, or even more, has to do with the European Union, right? So for them, this is a big deal. But there's only, I think, 2 European Union member states who have more than 10% of their external trade with the UK. I think it's Malta and Cyprus, I think, and Ireland, I think. So for the rest of them, the UK is an important trading partner, but it's not an existential one. So I think that's why for the European Union, this is more of an irritation rather than a huge deal.
Amanda, is that your take also on the Brussels perspective? Because that's something I'd say, since Americans usually look at Europe, I'm oversimplifying, through the lens of the UK, to oversimplify here. Maybe for Americans, we've thought this is a bigger deal for Brussels and the EU than it is in fact. I mean, so Amanda, is that also what you've seen or heard from Brussels?
I would agree in part. I think that there is great sadness within the EU that the UK is leaving, and I think it is a huge loss for the European Union. The UK has a very strong economy. It has a very strong military. It's a nuclear power. It's a UN Security Council seat. Britain's departure leaves France as the only UN Security Council member and nuclear power. And I think the UK was a very important and influential member. And so I don't think anybody's happy about it. And I think it is going to weaken in some ways the European Union. That said, I do agree from the perspective that now 3 years on, people are sick of it. So, it's you tell your wife 3 years ago you want to get a divorce. She's really sad. After 3 years of haggling, she just wants you to move out and be done with it. And, maybe if you did more yoga. But I think that's where we really are with this, that after 3 years of all of these negotiations, with a huge amount of time being spent on contingency planning and trying to negotiate deals, there is really a sense of fatigue. And it's still unclear what ends up happening in the elections in terms of how quickly this is going to end. And even if we are able to finalize the divorce deal, it really is only the end of the beginning, because now we need to do the hard part of working out what the future relationship is in terms of determining potentially a free trade agreement and the economic relationship. So I think we are nowhere near the end of these Brexit discussions.
Michael, I want to bring you in on this, especially since the security component was introduced there. Obviously, the UK being one of the 2 nuclear powers currently in the EU. I mean, obviously that'll be changing soon. One thing that sometimes seems to get lost in the discussion is, as much as at least half the UK population wants out of the EU, there's not been a groundswell of support in the UK to withdraw from NATO, for example, which is the most important security institution for the Europeans. What are your observations on what Brexit may mean or not mean for the European security order?
Yeah, so that's a very big question that we've got kind of going on right now with the NATO summit, just wrapping up in London, and sort of all of the drama on the sidelines there. But sort of the big questions is what's next for Europe, what's next for European security. So over the last few years, we've seen some really interesting trends emerge. There has always been a discussion of some sort of European level military force, right? And that discussion has ebbed and flowed as NATO has, sort of achieved prominence or sort of faded to the sidelines, never in the background, but certainly in the sidelines. And now you're starting to see in Europe kind of a re-emergence of some of that autonomous security capability, right? And the champion of this is Macron, who is, so a few years ago we had the sort of, I don't know if I'd call it famous or infamous or completely unknown acronym PESCO, right? Your Permanent Structured Cooperation, which everybody thought, oh, this is it. This is the beginning of the autonomous European security capability. And no, it really isn't. It's just the latest in a series of proposals. But Emmanuel Macron is pushing very hard for kind of a French-led, with Britain now on the sidelines and on its way out, but pushing for a French-led kind of European. Continental, perhaps, maybe is the best word, security presence that in some ways Europe has been waiting for since the beginning, really, since the failure of the European defense community all the way back in 1954. So Brexit is, I think, seen in some ways, especially by security professionals on the continent, as an opportunity for, yes, absolutely a loss from the EU's perspective, sort of one of the nuclear powers leaving EU, these sorts of things. But NATO will still be around, and you've got then this opportunity for Europe to essentially craft its own narrative on security.
So a follow-up to that, which I'd love to hear from any or all of you on, is the Russia question. This came up a little bit at our breakfast discussion with our students earlier today, but it's still not fully clear what role the Russian government and intelligence services may have played in the run-up to the Brexit vote itself. There seems to be some good evidence for at least some mischief-making, perhaps a lot. But we'll park that as a. But what is quite unambiguous is that Putin is applauding this. That Putin wants to see more dissolution, weakening, even disintegration of the European project and European unity, whether it's fissures within NATO, whether it's these various right and left wing populist movements, whether it's the Brexit. So for European policymakers, for British leaders, how much is the Russia factor part of their own consideration deliberations, or is it more like we're just going to figure this out on our own, and whether it comes out in ways that Putin likes or dislikes is irrelevant, or is it more like, hey, we need to be mindful that this is what Putin's larger game is, and we need to make sure that we're factoring that in. So, Amanda, let's start with you.
Sure. I'll make a couple of broad points. One on the question of Russian interference in the Brexit referendum campaign is still somewhat a matter of debate. It's very clear that there was Russian money that was given to the Leave campaign and was used during some of the run up to the referendum. There is a report that the British government has produced on Russian interference that Prime Minister Boris Johnson, for some reason, has decided not to publish until after the election, which raises the question of what is in there that he thinks the public shouldn't know before the election. If there was interference, it seems this would be helpful to disclose before the country goes back to the polls again. But when I've put this question about broader Russian interference to British officials, they've tended to make the point that they don't feel like it was definitive in terms of swaying the outcome of the election, that there was a sufficiently sizable number of people for a variety of reasons who wanted to leave the European Union, that notwithstanding the Russian money and influence, there still was a legitimate expression of the British population to leave the EU. On the broader question of where that leaves us with Russia, I think another part of Emmanuel Macron's comments in this Economist interview a couple weeks ago that has gotten a lot of pushback.
This was the one where he referred to NATO as brain dead?
Correct.
Okay,
correct.
Yes.
To pick up on this NATO discussion is his suggestion that NATO should not be seen as an enemy, that should not be seen as the primary impetus for NATO, and that instead of engaging in an arms race and treating Russia and China as enemies, the alliance should instead be focused on terrorism. And so certainly you've got a huge range of opinions on Russia within the EU, within NATO, with Poland and Baltic states certainly pushing back quite strongly on that. Britain having its own experience of the Skripal poisoning a year or two ago. And so this is also complicating some efforts within these transatlantic organizations to come to consensus, because there are differing opinions about the threat that Russia poses and how Europe should be responding to that.
Yeah, and the idea that Russia poses the same threat that it did when it was the Soviet Union in the Cold War is, sort of completely oversimplified, because Russia can do so much more than, given its capabilities, than it could, sort of as when it was the Soviet Union. It can act asymmetrically. It can act, all it has to do is disrupt, and it can achieve its objectives much more easily than, sort of sending hundreds of thousands of troops across the Fulda Gap, right? So Russia is actually...
That's very interesting for our listeners, as Michael is saying there, that Russia is now more capable
I am
of
in fact
exercising
saying
power
that,
and
yes.
influence abroad than it was when it was the Soviet Union, which is not always a narrative one hears. Okay.
Yeah, I will, sort of, that's a hill I'm prepared to, sort of defend. Absolutely.
The Russian bear's fangs are even sharper and claws are even more menacing.
Because we have to redefine capability, right?
Yeah,
and Russia can get a great deal more bang for its buck. The way that it, sort of operates now. Look, I mean, we can just work our way down the list with Crimea. Exactly. Yeah, absolutely right.
Donbass,
so we redefine capability to be disruption instead of, sort of defeat.
Yeah.
and we open up a brand new playbook for Russia. And I think we're seeing that play out. I think we have been seeing that play out really since 2014 for sure, but probably a few years before that as well.
I think what I would add to that discussion is, the question of how antagonistic to be towards Russia has always split member states within the European Union. That's nothing new. I think what is new is that the European Union is unsure which side of that the United States is on. That, I think, is a new development. And that is where I see a lot of what we were talking about just now in terms of this more concerted push to maybe have autonomous capabilities within the European Union, military capabilities. That, I think, is coming from the fact that the European member states have less confidence now than they did 2 years ago in Article 5 of NATO, in the U.S.'s commitment to defending the continent, in the U.S.'s commitment to be a counterweight to Russia. And that, I think, is what's partially pushing these developments. So it's not necessarily that just that the policy of Russia is changing. It's also that the policy of the United States vis-a-vis Russia is changing. And that's something that the Europeans are very attuned to.
Yeah. And that reminds me, I heard an interview the other day with Doug Lutz, our former NATO ambassador, who's a friend and former colleague of at least some of us here. And he was talking about the then ongoing, now just concluded NATO summit. And the question was, is Article 5 completely over? And he said, no, it's not that bad. But then he said, however, the problem is there's now sufficient doubt in the minds of most NATO members and, frankly, Putin, that Article 5 is viable, especially the United States is committed to it. He said, and that doubt right there, the very fact of that doubt dramatically raises the risk calculus.
And I think especially going back to what Michael was saying, because we're redefining capabilities. So it's Article 5, if you introduce some doubt into it, what that does is it raises the threshold of what I think Russia is prepared to do. Because this is not about invasions. It's how many green men is it willing to send into the Baltic states? How many cyber attacks is it willing to launch on Estonia?
How many mercenaries in Syria?
How many mercenaries is it willing to send to? Well, Syria is different because Article 5 doesn't come in. But those, I think, are the it's become more of a sliding scale because of the redefinition of capabilities, and therefore any doubt is actually moving the needle rather than having this sort of either you attack us or not. So that, I think, is the danger here.
And Article 5 was always questioned. I mean, the Cold War was always we could trade Boston for Bonn, right? I mean, but that was existential in many ways, right? I mean, that's the kind of strategic threat that we were talking about. And now things are changed dramatically, and now we've got what many are calling a transactional approach to security. And so President Trump said, just the other day about, Canada's contributions, right? And, sort of if you don't pay, then maybe Article 5 doesn't, you get a discount Article 5, I suppose. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah.
You get a strongly worded démarche.
Worded démarche. It's an excellent way to put it, right? Yeah.
The most potent weapon in the State Department arsenal. So that's right. So, yeah. All right, let's shift the discussion here a little bit to what might be going on with transatlantic political trends. A lot of analysts have wanted to situate the 2016 Brexit vote and the ongoing reverberations since then against the backdrop of this so-called, I say so-called because I don't want to assume anything, resurgence or upsurge in global populism. Certainly these transatlantic global populism. So it's put alongside the election of Trump in 2016, the ongoing appeal of Orban in Hungary, any of these other, populist parties in other European countries. So as an analytical matter, there's something nice and appealing about that because it helps us make sense of all that. Is that true? I mean, or is something like Brexit really sui generis? It's its own phenomenon, and we're just trying to artificially impose an analytical template on it if we treat it as part of, transatlantic or global populisms. So, Amanda, how do you think about this?
I think there certainly are similar trends cutting across Western democracies. I think if you look at the US, the UK, at continental Europe, immigration has been a factor in all of the debates. For the US, it's a focus on our southern border, whether people are crossing illegally. For the UK, it was the proverbial Polish plumber, people coming from the newer member states and seen as taking jobs and abusing the social welfare system. And in continental Europe, especially in Italy and Germany, I think some of the rise of the right has been part of the migration crisis of 2015, the floods of refugees coming in from Syria and elsewhere. A second factor is that you clearly have large swaths of the population that have not benefited from global integration, from international trade, and there's some pushback there that this system that has been structured is not working for them. And I think another commonality is a desire to reclaim sovereignty. There is a feeling that power has moved too far away from the people and that government is not necessarily working for all of them. So there's certainly, I think, distinctive national things that are shaping all of this in the particular personality of Donald Trump expressing these things in his own unique way. In Brexit, which, as we've discussed, within the UK, there has always been this trend of skepticism toward the EU, and certainly in the continent, there's different factors in Central and Eastern Europe. You have the legacy of communism and how that ends up affecting what people are experiencing now. So there are national differences, and I think we can't overstate the commonalities. But there certainly are common trends, I think, that are running through all of these Western democracies right now.
Mm-hmm.
So my wife is a historian, so me saying that everything is sui generis, she's just going to claim as a victory. So I'm very reluctant to do this. But I think I agree with Amanda.
Disciplinary
about
parochialism is ever lurking beneath the surface of all these discussions.
Indeed.
So right, yeah. As
Even
a
though I
historian
do
myself,
yoga.
I say listen to your wife more. So
Exactly.
right.
Even though I do yoga with her. So
Well done.
But I think so. I agree with all the comments that Amanda made. In terms of the specificities, just to sort of flip it around, I think the one difference with Brexit in particular is that there were sort of long brewing trends, I think, for the election of Trump, for the election of Orban in Hungary, for the election of Erdogan in Turkey. What I think is specific about Brexit is that it's an entirely self-inflicted problem, right? It was a problem essentially invented by David Cameron because he didn't want to stand up to his own crazies within his own party, and he called a referendum to try and outsource this disciplinary action, right?
And he thought he could kind of lance the boil the way they had with the Scottish referendum.
Exactly, right? And so that I think is a little bit different in the sense that there wasn't sort of a natural, to me at least, a natural lead up to this kind of decision in the United Kingdom. You could have had a populist government come into power, Boris Johnson win the prime ministership. That's not what I'm talking about. But Brexit itself, I think, was very much an engineered mistake that was avoidable, right? Whereas I don't think that's the case for instance, how Orban came to power in Hungary. Like there was no one person you can point to of, oh, that's your fault right there. So that I think is a little bit different, and that's why I think one of the reasons I said that the European member states and European leaders are somewhat irritated by Brexit is because they're like, why did we have to even go here? There's no reason we should be dealing with this at all. None of us were stupid enough to call a referendum on EU membership. So I think that's something that's a little bit peculiar to Brexit, and that's why I'm actually very surprised that the Conservatives are still leading in the polls.
I think people have described Brexit as psychodrama in the Conservative Party, and it really is a longstanding fight within the party. And if you look at opinion polls, up until the referendum was called, Europe is not anywhere in the top, 5-10 things that voters are concerned about. But what's interesting is Brexit has actually completely remade the British political system in that people now vote along Leave Remain lines rather than traditional left-right. So I think you're right that the origins of it are very, very different, but it's ended up remaking politics in a very different way.
Okay, so I will go broad here on my comments because I teach international relations and global studies, and we are a big, broad, interdisciplinary program. So one of the things that I think we can talk about are these trends, these global, sort of anti-globalization trends, for want of a better word, right? And so much of what whether it's the 2016 election, whether it's the 2016 Brexit referendum vote, whether it's the rise of populism in Europe or pretty much anywhere, a lot of this it's easy to be populist if you're anti something, right? And so Brexit is anti-Europe and Erdogan, anti-bureaucracy. Erdogan in Turkey is sort of anti-Western kind of, sort of neo-imperialism, right? And Orban in Hungary is anti-liberalism in many ways, right? And it's easy then to kind of, and you see this in Trump and sort of the Trump election in the 2016, you get a lot of folks who are tired of, or saying things like, government is doing things to me, right? And whether it be, sort of global institutions in many ways, or, I'm not really sure what I'm getting out of this, right? So I think you see this play out, and you see this play out across the board. We've been talking around this for a long time, but, Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party, goes back to the early 90s. I mean, this brought down Thatcher in many ways, or at least it really severely weakened her. And, the Conservative Party in Britain had figured out a constructive way to deal with this kind of anti-European notion for a while, until it didn't, right? I think you're absolutely right. It's a sort of self-inflicted wound. And much of what we're seeing here is just across the board, globally, is the failure of elected leaders to come to grips with this very strong anti-fill-in-the-blank movement. Because, again, it's easy. Populism can grab this and say, yes, this cri de coeur of, sort of something is out there that we hate. And it's easy to channel that, and it's easy to harness that, and it's easy to win democratic elections on this. What's really difficult is to kind of constructively move beyond that, right? And this is where we end up with. We have the paralysis of, okay, Brexit, great, out. So what next, right? I tell my students this is like the scene in Finding Nemo at the end when they escape the aquarium and they're all in the plastic bag floating in the water, and literally the last line of the movie is, okay, now what, right? And that's Brexit. That's pretty much everything else.
In that case, we had Finding Nemo 2, the sequel.
Yeah.
But
right.
I don't know what Brexit the sequel would be.
I know, right? Brexit the sequel will be.
And I think one point on that, this is I'm rarely optimistic about things, but the one slight hope that I have, right, is that what Michael was talking about, the trick is that it's really hard to explain all of the benefits of globalization and of the European Union because it's just omnipresent, right? And so what I think might happen after Brexit is you will actually see what happens when a member state voluntarily decides to cut off its nose to spite its face. And if you see massive recession, a lot of investment flooding out of the UK into Ireland or the Netherlands, then you will actually...
Or Zurich.
Or wherever it's going. You might actually see an actual example of what it's like when you cut yourself off from globalization and make that shift. And voters might see exactly what the costs are, right? Yes, you regain sovereignty, but you become irrelevant in the international system. You become much poorer, etc. So that, I think, is the interesting question: is that going to happen? And if so, is it still going to be blamed on the EU? Oh, the EU did this to us, or globalization did this to us? Or can you have a rhetoric that says, this is what happens when you try to get off this train? Like, that's not an option. You need to sort of steer the train, try to get influence on the conductor rather, but if you jump off, you're just going to hurt yourself. And that, I think, is going to be the interesting question sort of for me for the next 10 years is, does this mean that there's a kind of, is this a way to reverse some of these kind of populist trends to say, okay, you can be anti this, but then the choices that those result in are actually going to be much worse for you than where you started.
Amanda, I want to come back to a passing comment you made, which I'd wanted to ask about anyway, so I'm glad you brought it up. And this is what this might mean for the future of British politics. And you referred to a potential British, or maybe not even potential, maybe it's happening right now, British political realignment. Again, for our listeners, we're recording this just a few days before the upcoming British elections. We'll get it out just before those. So we, at this moment we're recording this, we don't know exactly what is happening in the British elections on December 12th. But Amanda, you already made a comment about some of the fracturing or realignment going on with the parties now, people now voting along Leave Remain lines. Tell us more about both what you see right now with British politics and then what this might mean. So, here's the thought experiment. If we record a sequel to this podcast 10 years from now, it'd be great to have all of us back here in Austin, Texas, 10 years from now. What will British politics look like 10 years from now?
Wow, we could spend an entire podcast speculating on all of that. Let me say a couple things. One, and we can come back to this. I think it is conceivable in 10 years that you have an independent Scotland and you have a unified Ireland. So one of the things, and I have written a long piece on this on the Brookings website.
Ledbrooks is taking odds on that right now. Okay,
if anyone is deeply interested, but there's already a push in Scotland for a second independence referendum. They had one in 2014, and they would argue that Brexit qualitatively changed changes the question because of the UK's decision to leave the European Union. And there's already conversations about whether or not there should be a border poll in Ireland, with Brexit also fundamentally changing the construct with the EU having provided the overarching framework in which the Good Friday Agreement was done. So that's one possibility in 10 years. Second, I think the points that were made about the period of reflection that this is going to end up creating in the UK about what it means to be outside the European Union. So I don't think necessarily within 10 years, but it is conceivable in a longer period of time that you see the UK wanting to rejoin the European Union. That now that they have gone through this thought experiment of what it means to be outside of the EU, they may decide that being in the club was not so bad after all. But that could take a generation, and likely the EU would not give them the favorable opt-outs that they have had in the past in terms of Schengen and the currency, and so they would have to come in with a much stronger sense of commitment than what they've had to date. Finally, in terms of what we're going to see in the elections are both hugely consequential and also very contested. I believe the statistic is 49% of British voters have switched parties in the last 3 elections. So
40%.
49.
49. Oh my goodness. Listeners, did you hear that? 49%. All right.
So you have
That is one of those wow statistics.
an incredibly volatile electorate that makes it very difficult to predict where they are going to go. And part of the problem is this realignment along Brexit-related lines, with the Conservative Party committed to delivering on the results of the referendum and implementing Brexit, and also still having a fairly traditional right-of-center, small state, limited regulation approach, but they have given up on their commitment to austerity and are actually running on a much higher spending platform. Then you have the Labour Party, where you have Jeremy Corbyn, who's a lifelong Eurosceptic, is personally supportive of Brexit, and has tried to walk a really fine line by saying that he would renegotiate the Brexit deal. It would be much better, much softer. The UK would stay in the customs union. And only after it was renegotiated would he put it to a referendum, and has refused to say at this point whether the party would support or oppose the referendum. He is also presenting a radically different economic view for people. He's a self-described socialist. He wants to abolish private schools. He wants to renationalize industries. And so for many voters, they have to decide between what for many is the lesser of two evils.
And there are concerns about anti-Semitism too. Of course.
Absolutely. And so it's a really difficult decision because people may not like Brexit, but they also dislike Corbyn personally. They dislike the anti-Semitism. They dislike the economic policy, and the Liberal Democrats have been unable to gain sufficient traction, and they've now had to shift their Brexit position from one initially was we will just revoke and not even give you the chance to have a second referendum to actually we realize we're not going to get the majority and revoke isn't really a great idea, so we'll support Corbyn's party if he ends up winning majority, which doesn't make them a particularly attractive option. In that case, people might as well just vote for Labour, and it's at least a cleaner vote. So that's why these are incredibly complicated elections, and I think a really unpredictable result. Even though the polling is currently suggesting that Boris Johnson has a 10-point lead. The challenge for him is he has to win a sizable majority because there are no parties that are willing to back him in coalition. The Northern Ireland Democratic Unionist Party that propped up Theresa May does not like his deal because of the way it treats Northern Ireland, and so they would not back him. So a Tory victory needs to be a complete victory, whereas on the opposition side, you could either have a minority Labour government or a Labour government propped up on an issue-by-issue basis by these other opposition parties.
Okay, well, Amanda, one follow-up on that, because you didn't mention UKIP. What is the potential role? And I know Boris has done some politicking there with the UKIP leadership and trying to neutralize them a little bit. But are they potentially a viable future force in British politics?
So UKIP has now essentially been replaced by the Brexit Party, but still headed by Nigel Farage. Interestingly, in the European Parliament elections that the UK was forced to hold in May because of its continued membership, the Brexit Party was the #1 party in the UK and actually has formed the largest party in the European Parliament. So you have this completely farcical situation of having to hold elections to an organization people wanted to leave, with the party devoted to leaving, winning the largest amount of seats in this institution. Nigel Farage has long been putting pressure on the Conservative Party. It was partly his pressure that led Cameron to decide to hold the referendum a couple of years ago, and he's been putting a lot of pressure on Boris Johnson, and has in fact already gotten him to say that he would not extend this 1-year transition period to negotiate the future relationship. He has decided not to stand candidates in every single constituency, including against Conservative incumbents. He is now limiting his targets to Labour seats. And so as a result of this, it really has been a gift to Johnson. His standing in the polls.
That was a significant concession.
Absolutely. His standing in the polls has dropped significantly as a result. So he does not look like he's going to be the potent force in this election that was previously feared.
Okay. All right. Michael Lawrence, anything to add on this?
Just a bit, that Britain, like the United States, has a first past the post voting system, which magnifies these kinds of sort of local trends in some ways, right? And so it's easy to fall into the Corbyn versus Johnson presidentialist kind of horse race metaphor. But there's a lot to be said for looking at local issues as well, right? And so when you're looking at the districts that are, especially on the border districts, sort of whether or not Johnson's Conservative Party is able to swing some of these seats in a way that sort of Amanda's talking about, the people who have switched seats back and forth, right? So it's not always about Brexit. There's a lot of questions about whether or not, sort of NHS reform is going to happen, what's going to happen in my particular district. So you see this really interesting paradox of these big national and international issues being played out, and the foreign press is really playing this as the Brexit election. But when you drill down into what's important for local voters, sometimes it really does come down to, is the roundabout in my district, sort of going to be expanded, that sort of thing, right? So we should not overlook the fact that this election, and that's what may or may not swing it one way or the other, is that Brexit matters. It's first and foremost in many voters' minds, but there's a lot of other things behind the scenes that are just as important.
So I'm going to take a sort of shotgun approach and say a couple of things about these are all great points. I think thinking about how what Amanda said, that Brexit has sort of solidified the two camps, and now people are voting according to their Brexit preferences rather than other left-right preferences. That is going to be temporary. If Brexit happens, so in 10 years, getting back to your question, that's not going to divide voters because it's no longer an issue. So weirdly, this election might not be a harbinger of that split. I think we're going to see even more volatility then. So I would imagine that we would have just as high percentages than switching their votes again for that following election, right? So I think that can be interesting. To Mike's point about whether this election is still going to be about Brexit at all, if you look at the current polling, the issue that ranks highest on British voters' radar is the health service. It's actually higher than Brexit, right? So weirdly, there's the election isn't entirely being fought on Brexit lines, even though I think the voters are separating themselves into those camps. So that's kind of an oddity, I think, and so we'll have to sort of see where that goes. But within that, I think what's really interesting is that the Conservative Party seems to have doubled down under Boris Johnson that it's going to be the Leave Party, right? Which of course is ironic because the entire reason we have the whole Brexit mess is because David Cameron wanted to get rid of the Eurosceptics within the Tory Party and make the Tory Party a normal, but what I mean by a pro-European business party, right? He wanted to sort of kick out the have a good argument for why to get rid of sort of the Brexiteers, and now the end result has been that the Tory Party has gone full in on being Eurosceptic. So I think that's kind of interesting. But he has locked down that vote because he managed to somehow convince Nigel Farage not to stand Brexit Party members against Tory candidates. So the Leave part of the campaign is quite united, which I think is interesting. Whereas the Remain part is extremely disorganized. So if I were a Remain voter in the UK, I literally would not know who to vote for. Before, at least the Liberal Democrats had a very strict line. If we have any say in the matter, we're going to undo this whole mess. That is if I'm a Remainer, that's a clear message that I can vote for. Now they've backtracked on that, which I actually think is going to hurt them because now they don't have a clear line. The Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn for the past 3-4 years has not managed to figure out what it thinks about Brexit. So I think if you are an opposition party and on the issue that is the second most important in voters' minds, you actually don't have a policy, I don't think you can win elections, right? So there, I think it's this is the weird thing is that you have the Remain side of the electorate really split. And then finally, getting back to sort of the more long-term trends, I actually do think that if Brexit happens, a united Ireland is just a question of time. There's no other way to solve the border problem than uniting the island. There's just no, you can sort of come up with all sorts of, Boris Johnson has said, oh, we'll just have technology. You can't hologram your way out of this problem, right? Either there's a border or there's no border. If there's a border, then you need to have a border somewhere else, like in the Irish Sea. If there's no border, then it's a united Ireland, right? So I actually think that's more likely than an independent Scotland, because a united Ireland is easier to square with EU membership. There's a precedent for German reunification, which meant that East Germany, that wasn't part of the EU, became part of the EU essentially overnight when Germany reunified. That's a doable political project.
Yeah.
Having a national minority hold a referendum to gain independence and then apply to the EU and get in, I think the Spanish government would have something to say about that.
Spain softened its
has
opposition
indeed.
following Brexit.
Yeah, I don't know. I have trouble seeing the sort of usual suspects of essentially those who don't recognize Kosovo, right? So this Cyprus, Slovakia, the Spanish sort of signing up to that. I think it's also much more complicated, and to a certain extent, the Scots need the UK to give them permission to have another referendum, and I just don't. I'm not sure that a Tory government would do that. So I find that to be a little bit more problematic. But I agree that in the long run, these are the trends that we're going to see.
So one more question I'm going to put to all of you, and we're going to again shift the locus here to American policy and strategy. All right, and so let me indulge me for a minute, being the historian, put this in historical context. From the American founding, one of America's primary security concerns has been avoiding European conflicts and not getting pulled into European conflicts, and ideally reducing and eliminating European conflicts. This is why, from the end of World War II forward, a bipartisan pillar of American strategy towards Europe has been supporting the European unification, supporting the European project. Originally, it was to ensure that a resurgent Germany didn't launch a third continental war in 50 years, something like that. That quickly evolved into keeping a relatively unified Europe as an alliance partner and balancer against the Soviet Union and now Russia. What does the current moment and then potential future of some of these fractures within the European project mean for American strategy? Our current president supports Brexit. It does not seem to be a supporter of European unity. Maybe he's an aberration, or maybe, again, if we're here 10, 15 years from now, whatever has happened with the American presidency, will we still be talking about a pillar of American strategy towards Europe as supporting European unity, or are we also going through a fundamental realignment there as well? Amanda, let's start with you. You worked on this quite a bit in your time in government. So.
Right. So if you talk to Europeans, they would argue that American withdrawal from Europe started under the Obama administration. Obama, was no fan of sitting around holding European Union summits. He talked about the pivot to Asia. He was seen as being much more focused on the Pacific powers than on the Atlantic powers. As somebody who was working on Europe in the State Department at that time, my argument to the Europeans was, we want you to pivot with us. The United States has invested very heavily in Europe. We have integrated a lot of the former post-communist countries into the European Union and NATO. You are now all positioned to be able to be security providers rather than security consumers. And so we need you to work with us on Asia. And if that's not possible, we at least want you to do more focusing on your own neighborhood, which frees our resources up to focus on Asia. So Europeans would argue that they already felt the withdrawal during the last administration. Certainly President Trump, again, in his own very unique way, has been much more vocal on this. He has called Brexit a great thing. He sees the EU as an economic foe. And I think he is right in the sense that the EU is much more powerful economically as an economic bloc against the United States than individual countries are against the US, which really is the strength of the European Union. And he has actively sought to undermine the unity of the EU. I think that would differ either if you had another Republican president or certainly if there was a Democratic administration. One of the things that I think will be consistent, even if you do have a Democratic Democratic president in 2021, is the need to fundamentally rethink burden sharing within the alliance. There's a lot of discussion in the United States about wanting to end these endless wars. There is frustration that predates even the Obama administration with European lack of defense spending, European lack of capabilities.
That goes back to the Truman administration. So
Right,
yeah, okay,
right. So this is something that has long been a problem. And so if you have a Democratic president, I think you will have much more focus on alliances, much more focus on trying to rebuild these relations. But there will be this continued conversation about Europe needing to do much more to provide its own security, and a continued effort on the United States being less active in providing the security umbrella for Europe that they've gotten used to over the last number of decades.
Michael
So
Lawrence?
I would say very quickly that what we see now, and sort of from 2016 on, and arguably since the Obama administration, is the fundamental challenge of maintaining institutions. The institutions are only as strong as the belief in them, right? And so you can have these things set up, the post-World War II institutions, whether it's Bretton Woods on the economic side, or NATO on the alliance side, or the European Union in its particular, sort of distinct way. The European Union has had a really hard time from its beginning explaining what it is to its own members, let alone, and to its own people, let alone to everybody else, right? And so when you have challenges to these institutions, fundamental challenges to the identities, sort of these institutions, it takes constant reinforcement to make these things work, and it doesn't take much to tear them down. So from a U.S. perspective, or from sort of a global perspective, I really do think that we are in an inflection point where the actual sort of fundamental viability of institutions may be irrevocably weakened. We may be headed to a world of, sort of regional at best, and probably more, sort of, who's to say that everything since 1945, that this kind of, sort of teleological notion that we are always improving, that this is the right thing to be ended with. Maybe we're going back to, sort of a pre-45 world where individual, or at least regional nation-state blocks are calling the shots.
I think, getting back to the historical question, I think the U.S. was always interested in maintaining peace in Europe because it's so expensive for the U.S. when there isn't. But at the same time, there was always some ambivalence in the United States about European integration. European integration was great when it led to peace and stability, but anytime that it seemed like that was going to potentially be a rival to the United States, then the support was much more muted. And this was especially noticeable in the security field, right? So the US has had this very complicated relationship with efforts to create common European security outside of the realm of NATO. And so what I think was interesting, all administrations have been trying to walk this tightrope of supporting European integration, but saying, but don't do this outside of NATO in the security realm. One thing that the United States really had is it had one real way to influence European politics and discussion about this, which was through the UK. So I think the big difference that's going to happen if Brexit happens is that the US will lose a lot of influence on this debate within Europe. So the continental debate now that Michael referred to earlier about whether there should be autonomous military capability, whether we should have like an EU army even, whether there should be much more security cooperation, the US will have zero influence on that. Because if the UK has left the EU. And that, I think, is a difference, because that was the lever that I think the US had because of the special relationship. And that's why I think it's actually and that's not something that can be undone by a new administration. That's a structural element of Brexit. And that, I think, is going to be, it's not that the strategy of the US would necessarily change. Its capabilities to influence European decision-making on security matters, I think, will be weakened in the future.
And again, another irony on all that is, of course, arguably the most well-resourced and capable European military is France, the French. And yet with Macron now being the leading voice of saying we can't rely on the Americans anymore, that's potent when it's coming from the head of government for the most capable European
military.
It's a
very Gaullist perspective. This is nothing new. It's going us back to the future for France.
Yeah, this is 1966 all over again.
Absolutely.
So anyway. All right. Well, our time is up. Lawrence, Michael, Amanda, thank you very much. It's been a great discussion, and we will all be watching events in the UK abroad with keen interest. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Be sure to check out all of our content online for free at tnsr.org.